All right, so we're in Job chapter 30. We're getting closer and closer to the time when God himself is going to step into the picture and make some much needed corrections here with Job's friends. And even Job, his understanding is increased significantly when the Lord comes to speak to him. So in chapter 30, what we see here is Job is looking around at God's judgment, and he has these 5 complaints which parallel the joys that he had listed in the previous chapter. The first one was, I have no respect. That's verses 1 through 15, and he talks about the young men who at one point when he would be coming down the road, they would step out of the way. They would make room for him as he came, and now they're mocking him and they're spitting in his face. And probably one of the reasons that happened was because now they see Job as being an outcast just like they are. So he's now equal. What we see, the second one, verses 16 through 23, he's saying, I have no blessing. In verse 16 he says, and now the days of affliction have taken hold upon me. And he accuses God of robbing him of even the basic enjoyments of life. You know, in the daytime, Job is enduring this unbearable suffering, this physical malady, psychological malady because of the loss of his family. And then at night, God wrestled with him, and then Job says he threw him in the mud. So let's read those verses 16 through 23. And now my soul is poured out within me. Days of affliction have seized me. At night it pierces my bones within me, and my gnawing pains take no rest. By a great force my garment is distorted. It binds me about as the collar of my coat. He has cast me into the mire, and I have become like dust and ashes. I cry out to thee for help, but you do not answer me. I stand up, and you do turn your attention against me. You have become cruel to me with the might of your hand. You do persecute me. You do lift me up to the wind and cause me to ride, and you do dissolve me in a storm. For I know that you will bring me to death, and to the house of meeting for all living. That's a pretty dire set of verses there. What he's feeling at this time at night, he feels like that God's got him in a straitjacket, basically, and it's going to throw him in the mud.
Do we know how long this happens to him? How long he has to go through this?
No.
Sounds like a bunch of days.
Several days, yeah. I mean, when you take into account, for the first week, nobody says anything. So there's 1 week he's suffering. And then you look at each one of these speeches of these men. We don't know how long that took either, but here he references what happens to him at night. So obviously this has gone on for some period of time. And, that's the thing, is that Job, he never loses faith. He always keeps his faith in God. He questions some things. And we see in this section where he accuses God of some things, but he never loses his faith in God. And what he's feeling here in this particular section is, Job prays to God, but he feels like instead of getting help, he's just getting pounded on more and more. His third complaint in verses 24 and 25 is, I have no help. Yet does not one in a heap of ruin stretch out his hand, or in his disaster therefore cry out for help? Have I not wept for the lone, whose life is hard? Was not my soul grieved for the needy? So here he's saying, I've got nobody to help me. God's against me. I don't have any friends that are going to help me. And that would just have to be just a horrible feeling. Feeling like you have absolutely no help. And before all this happened, Job was very good about taking care of the needy people, the poor, and helping them out. And now he's being treated like a leper that might contaminate them, or like a condemned man whom God might destroy at just any time. Job had to be asking, where were these other people who I've already helped at one point? And you would think some of them would want to show their appreciation by encouraging him, by reaching out to him and lifting him up, but nobody comes to his aid. Fourth complaint he has, 26 through 28, is, I have no future. When I expected good, then evil came. When I waited for light, then darkness came. I am seething within and cannot relax. Days of affliction confront me. I go about mourning without comfort, and I stand up in the assembly and I cry out for help. Prior to this onslaught of events, Job had expected to enjoy this long, comfortable, happy life and a peaceful death, but now it's all been changed. And all he sees at this point is evil, and he sees darkness. And I don't know about you, and I can't explain it physiologically, but when we're hurting and we're not sleeping either, things seem so much worse. The pain can intensify, the stress intensifies, the anxiety intensifies, and that's the sense I get from him here, is he's not getting hardly any sleep. During the day, his friends are just beating on him. During the night, he's wrestling with God, trying to find these answers. This is a man that's just exhausted. And his fifth complaint is, I have no ministry, and we see that in verses 29 through the end of the chapter. I have become a brother to jackals and a companion of ostriches. My skin turns black on me, and my bones burn with fever. Therefore my harp is turned to mourning, and my flute to the sound of those who weep. Before he'd been a source of encouragement for other people, but now his words were empty, or sounded like jackals or the howling owls. And because his hope was dead, he just feels like he's at his own funeral, basically. So he's very, very discouraged at this point. In Job chapter 31, what we see here, this is Job's final defense. And it's like a legal document where Job is going to put himself under oath before God, and he asks for judgment to fall if God can prove him wrong. And that's a pretty serious oath. And Job's only hope at this particular point is that God's going to hear him and he's going to vindicate him. And he feels like he could die in peace if he knew that his enemies had been silenced and his reputation restored. So let's read the first 12 verses, chapter 31. I've made a covenant with my eyes. How then could I gaze at a virgin? And what is the portion of God from above, or the heritage of the Almighty from on high? Is it not calamity to the unjust and disaster to those who work iniquity? Does he not see my ways and number all my steps? If I have walked with falsehood and my foot has hastened after deceit, let him weigh me with accurate scales, and let God know my integrity. If my step is turned from the way, or my heart followed my eyes, or if any spot is stuck to my hands, let me sow and another eat, and let my crops be uprooted. If my heart has been enticed by a woman, or I've lurked at my neighbor's doorway, may my wife grind for another, and let others kneel down over her. For that would be a lustful crime. Moreover, it would be an iniquity punishable by judges. For it would be a fire that consumes to abandon, and would uproot all my increase. In this section, Job mentions three specific sins that can trip up any human being, us included in that. Verses 1 through 4, he talks about lust. And lust is that first step towards sin. In James chapter 1, verses 13 through 16, James tells us, you lust, you sin, you die. That's the pattern. So while sin in the heart, which is where lust really starts, Jesus said if you look upon another with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery with that particular person. And so while lust isn't necessarily as bad as the physical act, it still is that first step towards that act. In verses 5 through 8, he talks about deceit. And Job is denying that he has these particular sins. And you get the sense of the anger boiling up in his friends that were around him. He never used deception in his business dealings. And in fact, he wouldn't even walk with those who did those things. His scales, he talks about the scales. His scales were honest. They were perfectly balanced. They weren't tipped in any particular way to benefit him. And so because his scales were honest, he's not afraid for God to weigh him in God's scales. And if he was guilty of covetousness and deception, then Job is willing for his next season's crops to be taken by others. In other words, you can have it all. And then, of course, the third one at the end of this is the adultery itself. Job had never snuck around to see when his neighbor's wife would be all alone. He was a man of integrity, a man of honor. And if he was guilty of doing that, then he's willing to give up his wife to another man. So he's pretty adamant that, I'm a man of integrity. That doesn't mean he didn't sin, but these specific sins, he said, those aren't mine. And his friends, of course, accuse him of those things. The second thing we see here is Job describes himself as an employer in verses 13 through 15. If I have despised the claim of my male or female slaves when they filed a complaint against me, what then could I do when God arises? And when he calls me to account, what will I answer him? Did not he who made me in the womb make him, and the same one fashion us in the womb? Job was very careful about his self-examination, and here he's looking at how he even treated his slaves. He treated them quite well. And certainly in that particular day, but also if you think about the period in this nation's history when we went through slavery, most masters wouldn't have included that in an assessment of themselves, if you will. In other words, they treated slaves as property, and they could beat someone and not think twice about it. And Job's like, that's not me. I treated these people very, very well. In 16 through 23, and then again in 29 to 32, Job describes himself as what kind of a neighbor he was to other people. If I have kept the poor from their desire, or have caused the eyes of the widow to fail, or have eaten my morsel alone, and the orphan has not shared it, but from my youth he grew up with me as with the father, and from the infancy I guided her. If I have seen anyone perish for lack of clothing, or that the needy had no covering, if his loins have not thanked me, and if he has not been warmed with the fleece of my sheep, if I have lifted up my hand against the orphan because I saw I had support in the gate, let my shoulder fall from the socket, and my arm be broken off at the elbow. For calamity from God is a terror to me, and because of his majesty I can do nothing. And then 29 through 32, have I rejoiced at the extinction of my enemy, or exulted when evil befell him? No, I have not allowed my mouth to sin by asking for his life and curse. Have the men of my tent not said, who can find one who has not been satisfied with his meat? The alien has not lodged outside, for I have opened my doors to the traveler. Remember, Eliphaz accused him of doing those very things. And Job says, nope, I have not done that. And here he, in detail, records how he treated the poor and the needy. But now he's made it part of this oath that he's taking. And if he had lifted his hand in court against any man, Job is asking God to basically rip his arm off, because he certainly hasn't done that. Job describes himself as being a good neighbor to his own enemies. He didn't want any evil to befall them just because they were doing evil to him, but also to strangers going through town. He would open his doors. He was showing hospitality to people. And Job was an honorable man. Verses 24 through 28, Job describes himself as a worshiper and how he would worship. If I have put my confidence in gold and called fine gold my trust, if I have gloated because my wealth was great and because my hand had secured so much, if I have looked at the sun when it shone, or the moon going in splendor, and my heart became secretly enticed, and my hand threw a kiss from my mouth, that too would have been an iniquity calling for judgment, for I would have denied God above. So Job worships God with a very sincere heart. He doesn't trust his wealth. He's thankful for it, but he sure doesn't trust it for security. And he also doesn't take credit for earning it. He's very well aware of where his wealth comes from. And this reference here, where he's talking about the sun and these different heavenly bodies, is very common in that time that people would worship those particular objects. And Job says, that's not me. I worship the true and living God. I don't worship those things. 38 through 40, Job describes himself as a steward, how he takes care of things. If my land cries out against me and its furrows weep together, if I have eaten its fruit without money, or have caused its owners to lose their lives, let briars grow instead of wheat, and stinkweed instead of barley. And then what we see here, it says the words of Job are ended. He's done with his defense. He's not going to do it anymore. And he basically signs this oath and signs this document. And in listening through all these things to be complete, Job says, just so I'm not missing anything, how have I taken care of my land? He's been a very good steward in that area of his life. And in this description here, he's basically describing land as like a person. He says, I took care of that land just like I took care of other people. And if I've abused that land, God can punish me. But he certainly hadn't done that. What we see in chapters 32 through 33 is this fourth friend who speaks now. And we assume he's sitting there and he's been absorbing the whole thing. He hasn't said one word until this particular point when we get into chapter 32. So Job's sitting there, he's quiet, he's ended his defense. This oath he just took says, I'm not guilty of any sins that you guys have accused me of. And he had challenged God to either vindicate him or pass sentence on him and just be done with it. And Job's other three friends are sitting there and they're not saying anything. And it could be because they were a little appalled at how he spoke to God and how he spoke about God. It didn't fit their picture. The silence was of God himself. They're sure that God's going to strike him down. There's going to be a bolt of lightning come out of the heavens to strike him down, because they knew that was all that was left, was just judgment. But certainly, God was very silent with this. But it's also instructive that God is not at the beck and call of his creatures, of his creation. This friend Elihu, what we'll see is he'll say some of the same things as the other speakers, but his purpose is much different than theirs. He's not going to try and prove that Job was a sinner, but that Job's view of God was wrong. And he introduces a new truth to the debate, that God sends suffering not necessarily to punish us for our sins, but to keep us from sinning and to make us better persons. And certainly with that first point, the Apostle Paul would agree with that. In 2 Corinthians chapter 7, he references that, some of the sufferings and the thorn in the flesh and all of those things, and specifically the thorn in the flesh to keep him from sinning. Paul was a very accomplished man in the Jewish system, and then he becomes a Christian, and he's building churches all over and has numerous friendships with people, and so pride would have been a very easy thing for him to fall victim to. God sends him a thorn in the flesh to keep him from doing that. So certainly Paul would have agreed with that first point. Elihu's going to make two affirmations about God, and the first one's in chapter 32. The second one we'll see in chapter 33. So this first one, first affirmation that Elihu makes, he says, God is speaking through me. And Elihu emphasizes that he waited patiently before speaking, and he gives two reasons for it. First, he was younger than Job and all the three friends. And so it would have been a breach of etiquette had he spoken up at any point before they were through. And the second reason was because he wanted to hear the complete debate and have all the arguments before him. I think that's wise. And I think that's wise for us today, too. Is to sit back and to gather all the facts together before we start making judgments. Too soon or too often we hear something and we fly off. And I'm guilty of that, too. And then, of course, I feel very chastised later when I learned the complete truth and how my reaction to it was. And I thought, that kind of mature in that particular area. So I think while he's younger, he's a mature young man. And what we'll see, he's going to quote from several other speeches, which means he was listening very carefully. He was taking note of it. And Elihu, unlike the other friends, he's got a very sincere heart for Job. He really wants to enlighten him, if you will, to what he thinks is the right view to have. And so, having introduced himself into this discussion, he then gives 4 reasons to explain why it was important for him to speak and for them to listen. In verses 1 through 3, and again in verse 5, these 3 men ceased answering Job because he was righteous in his own eyes. But the anger of Elihu, son of Barachel, the Buzite, of the family of Ram, burned. Against Job his anger burned because he justified himself before God. And his anger burned against his 3 friends because they had found no answer and yet had condemned Job. And when Elihu saw that there was no answer in the mouth of the 3 men, his anger burned. So he's just mad at everybody at this particular point. He's mad at Job for justifying himself rather than God. He's mad at the other 3 guys for not refuting Job. He didn't feel like that they refuted his arguments at all. Job had claimed that God was wrong, and his 3 friends couldn't prove that he was wrong. In verses 8 through 10, the other reason he thinks it's important for him to be heard is because he's inspired. But it is the spirit in man, and the breath of the Almighty gives him understanding. The abundant years may not be wise, nor may elders understand justice. So I say, listen to me. I too will tell what I think. He doesn't claim, because he's a younger man, he doesn't claim to have all the experience that the older guys do. But he does claim to have insight from God. And again, because of that, he's exhorting his friends and Job to listen to him. It's very important. He says that he's impartial in verse 14 and then 21 through 22. For he has not arranged his words against me, nor will I reply to him with your arguments. Let me now be partial to no one, nor flatter any man, for I do not know how to flatter, else my Maker would soon take me away. And so he makes it clear here, he has no reason for taking sides, since Job or the other 3 guys have not attacked him personally. He's going to remain very impartial with this. And he also says he's not going to rehash any of the same old arguments, but he breaks that promise. He's going to do some of that. In verses 16 through 20, he says, listen to me because I'm impelled to speak. And shall I wait because they do not speak, because they stop and answer no more? I too will answer my share. I also will tell my opinion. For I am full of words, the spirit within me constrains me. Behold, my belly is like unvented wine, like new wineskins that is about to burst. Let me speak that I may get relief. Let me open my lips and answer. He's waited a long time to speak. He's been listening to all of this, and he's just kind of building up, almost like a pressure cooker. Pressure's coming up, and he's about to explode. He's got to get it out. And Job says, I've got this mandate from God to tell everybody what he told me and what I know. That's a pretty dangerous place. And what he doesn't know that is when God does appear on the scene, God will completely ignore everything this young man has to say. In Job 33, what we see here, Elihu says that God is gracious. Job's friends had argued that his suffering was evidence that God was punishing him for his sins, but now Elihu argues that sometimes God permits us to suffer to keep us from sin. In other words, suffering can be preventative or it can be punitive. And for the believer, it's never punitive. And so before launching into this argument, Elihu assures Job that his words are sincere and that God's Spirit has actually given him the words. So Job has no reason to be afraid. And Elihu didn't want this to turn into just a one-way dialogue, but unfortunately, that's what it turns into. So let's read the first 11 verses of 33. However now, Job, please hear my speech, and listen to all my words. Behold now, I open my mouth. My tongue and my mouth speaks. My words are from uprightness of my heart, and my lips speak knowledge sincerely. The Spirit of God has made me, and the breath of the Almighty gives me life. Refute me if you can. Array yourselves before me. Take your stand. Behold, I belong to God like you. I too have been formed out of the clay. Behold, no fear of me should terrify you, nor should my pressure weigh heavily on you. Surely you have spoken in my hearing, and I have heard the sound of your words. I am pure, without transgression. I am innocent, and there is no guilt in me. Behold, he invents pretexts against me. He counts me as his enemy. He puts my feet in the stocks. He watches all my paths. And in verse 12, behold, let me tell you, you're not right in this, for God is greater than man. And so what Elihu does is he repeats these words, these claims from Job, and what Job had said about himself. First, Elihu says that Job claimed to be sinless, and Job never said that. He never said, I'm not sinless. That was Zophar's interpretation. Job had said that he didn't lie, he wasn't wicked, he was just and upright, and that he hadn't disobeyed God, but he never said he was sinless. He consistently maintained his integrity, but he never said he was perfect. There's a big difference there. And Elihu's basic premise is pretty weak because he confused Zophar's words with Job's words. Job wasn't saying that he was sinless, he was saying he was blameless. There's an entirely different thing there. Second, in verses 10 and 11, he quotes Job as saying that God was unjust and was treating him like an enemy. And indeed, Job did say that. But Elihu's great concern wasn't to debate what Job said about himself, but to debate what Job had said about God. And in verses 12 through 14, what we see is kind of the thesis, if you will, of his speech. Behold, let me tell you, you are not right in this, for God is greater than man. Why do you complain against him, that he does not give an account of all his doings? Indeed, God speaks once or twice, yet no one notices it. He's saying, he's going to describe these different ways that God may speak to men. First, he talks about dreams and visions. Then he talks about suffering, and then he talks about the ministry of the mediating angel. And so let's read, beginning in verse 14. We'll read to the end of the chapter, and then we'll come back and look at different sections of it. Indeed, God speaks once or twice, yet no one notices it. In a dream, a vision of the night, when sound sleep falls on men, while they slumber in their beds, then he opens the ears of men and seals their instruction, that he may turn man aside from his conduct and keep man from pride. He keeps back his soul from the pit and his life from passing over into Sheol. Man is also chastened with pain on his bed and with unceasing complaint in his bones, so that his life loathes bread and his soul favored food. His flesh wastes away from sight, and his bones, which were not seen, stick out. Then his soul draws near to the pit, and his life to those who bring death. If there is an angel as mediator for him, 1 out of 1,000, to remind a man what is right for him, then let him be gracious to him and say, deliver him from going down to the pit, for I have found a ransom. Let his flesh become fresher than in youth. Let him return to the days of his youthful vigor. Then he will pray to God, and he will accept him, that he may see his face with joy, and he may restore his righteousness to man. He will sing to men and say, I have sinned and perverted what is right, and it is not proper for me. He has redeemed my soul from going to the pit, and my life shall see the light. Behold, God does all these oftentimes with men, to bring back his soul from the pit, that he may be enlightened with the light of life. Pay attention, O Job, listen to me, keep silent and let me speak. Then, if you have anything to say, answer me. Speak, for I desire to justify you. If not, listen to me, keep silent, and I will teach you wisdom. Pretty bold claim there. What we see first is where, in this particular section, the pit is mentioned 5 different times. What he's saying is that in verse 18, God seeks to keep people from the pit. Of course, that's Sheol or hell. God doesn't want anyone to perish. That's what we're told in the New Testament. And then in verse 22, what you see is, rebellious sinners are actually drawn to the pit. In verse 24, they go down to the pit. In verse 28, into the pit. And then in verse 30, he talks about this mediator that comes back. So the first section in verses 15 through 18, he talks about these dreams and visions. And of course, we know that in the Old Testament, very, very often, not necessarily that rare, but God would speak to men in dreams and visions. Whereas today, primarily, we're directed by His Spirit through His Word. Does God still speak to people today in dreams? Could. One of the things, when I first heard about this, I'll admit I was a bit skeptical. But then you hear more and more and more and more and more cases of this happening, and I'm convinced that I think it is a real thing. But people in Muslim countries especially, there have been a number of cases where that person is just a devout Muslim. And the person later claims that Jesus comes to him in a dream. And then they come across a Christian and they're converted. There was one man, I believe it was Saudi Arabia, in a dream he saw Jesus, a likeness of him, and Jesus told him, I want you to go to this next town. And that town was 5 or 6 miles away. I want you to go to this address, and I want you to ask for this man. And he'll tell you what you have to do. And in that dream, this was a guy he'd never met before ever in his life. And he shows up at the guy's house. He knocks on the door, and the man says, can I help you? And he says, Jesus told me to talk to you, and that you would tell me what to do. And I went to the house and explained the gospel to him, and he was converted. There's been numerous other examples like that. So, can God do it? Absolutely. God can do anything He wants to. But certainly today we don't see that as often as it's done through His Word. I think it's important to remember that not all of our dreams have hidden meanings. And not all of our dreams come from God, if you will. You know that there's a lot of physical factors that can explain that. If you're sleep deprived, if you're on certain medications. For some people, whatever it is they ate, and they can tell you what their dream is going to be that night. So certainly we don't have, that doesn't occur to us typically. In verses 19 through 22, Elihu talks about suffering, how God uses suffering. C.S. Lewis, in his book, The Problem of Pain, he says, God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. I think there's a lot of truth in that. Certainly when we're suffering and we're having difficult times, what's our tendency? Where do we go for help? We go to God, right? When times are going good and we're not under that kind of stress, and physically we feel fine, how often do we go to God? Typically not as often, right? When we should. Hebrews chapter 12, the first 11 verses there, says that God will sometimes use pain to warn us. He'll use pain to humble us, and He'll use pain to bring us to a place of submission. So Elihu, he describes a sick man suffering on his bed, wasting away without an appetite. But Elihu says this man is suffering because God wants to get his attention, prevent him from breaking God's law. Does all suffering come from God? No. I agree with that. Sometimes because of our irresponsibilities, we bring the suffering on ourselves. If you drive carelessly and you have a wreck, you don't hurt yourself, you may hurt other people. Of course, there's legal consequences for it. Certainly, as Christians, we can't say that suffering is a punishment for sin. We know our sins were dealt with at the cross. So Elihu argues that sometimes God permits suffering to keep people from sinning and going into the pit. And as we said, God gave Paul this thorn in the flesh. And so Elihu presents two ways that God speaks to people in order to keep them from the pit: the visions and dreams, the sickness and the pain. And now he's going to present the third, which is his ministry of the mediating angel in verse 23 to the end of the chapter. Remember that the book of Job opens with this description of God's court in heaven, where the angels, and some translation may say sons of God, that's what the angels were, report for duty. And here, Elihu paints an awesome picture. He says the sinner's been warned by dreams and visions. He's been chastened by God through sickness and suffering. He's getting near to the grave. In verse 22, it may say the destroyers or the messengers of death. They're about to capture him. And then all of a sudden, a special messenger stands up and pleads his case. And that's what he means by one among 1,000. And this messenger has a twofold ministry. In verse 23, he tells the sufferer what he ought to do, and then he intercedes with God to have the person restored. And so Elihu has some idea of this. And certainly for us, we know that this mediator is the angel of the Lord. The Lord who gave his life as a ransom for us, rescued us from the pit. Elihu sees this angel not only as a mediator, but also as the provider of the ransom. And he's telling Job, this is the mediator that you've been asking for throughout the entire debate. Remember, Job wants an umpire to bring him and God together for trial. He wants this witness to argue his case before God and the Redeemer who vindicates him even after his death. Those are the things that he wanted. In verse 24, Elihu says that this ministry of this angel is purely an act of God's grace, where it says, spare him from going down to the pit, I have found a ransom for him. And this concept of the ransom, this is seen all throughout the Bible. It's biblical theology. And the Hebrew word for ransom means to atone for sin by the offering of a substitute. A condemned sinner, you can't be set free from paying money, certainly not from doing good works or even with good intentions. It has to be a ransom that God's going to accept, and God has already told us the only thing that he's going to accept is the sacrifice of shed blood. You see that in Leviticus. Job didn't ask his 3 friends to ransom him because he knew that they couldn't do that. Only God can provide that ransom, and he did. So Elihu promises Job that God is going to alter his situation if he would just humble himself. So, we see this, it almost sounds like, here we go, like the same old record starting back up again. In verse 25, he says, if you do this, it's going to be like a new birth. In verse 26, if you humble yourself, you're going to enjoy prayer and fellowship with God. In verse 27, if you'll just confess your sins and admit that God had punished him far less than he deserves. That's what Elihu is telling him. And then in verse 28, if you'll just do that, Job, you'll move out of the darkness and into the light, and you'll gladly bear witness of God's redemption. Verses 31 through 33 suggest that Elihu wants some kind of response from Job, but at the same time, he really wants Job to keep quiet. He's on a roll now, he wants to keep going. But Job doesn't respond because Job is waiting for God to speak. That was his whole intent. Job had already fully stated his case. He'd thrown down the gauntlet. He'd signed that oath. And so whatever Elihu's going to say about Job, to Job, it really doesn't matter anymore. And then in chapters 34 through 37, which we'll start up next week, Elihu's going to explain and defend God. In 34, he talks about 2 of Job's complaints that were to be discussed when Job said that God was unjust And in verses 7 through 9, there's no profit in serving God. And so he's going to answer that first complaint in chapter 34 and the second complaint in chapter 35. So I don't know about you, but as I've gone throughout the week and preparing and studying, I'm ready for these guys to zip it. I'm ready for the Lord to show up because it gets very fatiguing. Any questions or comments?